My name is Carl Trueman, and I've been involved with the Ethics and Public Policy Centre for just over 3 years. I've been aware of the EPPC for many years. I've lived in the States since 2001, and I think at some point in my first decade, I was alerted to the existence of the EPPC and started to read its website because of the great articles and commentary on political and cultural events and happenings that it offers. My full-time job is that I teach religious studies at Grove City College in Western Pennsylvania, where my focus really is on the history of the church and also upon religious cultural analysis. The confluence of my work in the EPPC is the EPPC is attempting to speak persuasively to the cultural moment in which we find ourselves. And as a trained historian, I've been taught to analyze particular moments in history and understand why they've come about, why people think the way they do, and what sort of arguments resonate in particular cultures at particular moments in time. So I think the ambitions of the EPPC and the skills that I bring in as a historian have an interesting connection. The shifts in the culture that I study tend to focus upon the rise of what is known as identity politics. Particularly interested in how understanding of what it means to be a human being, of what it means to be us, has changed over the years. And we are at the moment at a very interesting cultural moment where the big question of our day, I think, is what does it mean to be a human being? The challenge comes from various directions, perhaps most predominantly at this point from technology. We're all aware of artificial intelligence and also the challenges that transhumanism present. And so my interests really lie in what are the cultural factors that have made ideas such as transhumanism plausible, not just to those who've read the philosophy, but even to the man or woman in the street. One of the big challenges the EPPC face, as all such institutions do, is helping young people to think clearly about who they are, about their identity. What we need to do is present a compelling narrative, one that grips the imagination of young people today. And the EPPC, I think, feeds into that because we're essentially committed to the idea that there is such a thing as human nature, and that articulating that and presenting that to our audience will naturally resonate with the intuitions that inhere in that nature. So EPPC, I think, has an extremely important role relative to giving young people an important sense of what it means to be human. And we provide great resources. The articles that are linked to from the website touch on that issue from various perspectives: religious, philosophical, legal, cultural. And reading those articles will help young people understand why the things that they take as natural are actually the result of cultural forces of which they may not even be aware. I've been teaching at institutions of higher education on both sides of the Atlantic now for 32 years. And one of the big things that I've seen emerge on campuses really in the last 5 or 10 years is the role of online discourse. So many young people today are not so much shaped by parents, family, church, context in which they grew up, or even by the teachers that they are taught by in the classroom, but they're shaped by social media. They're shaped by TikTok. They're shaped by online influences. And one of the things I think the EPPC does and does well is it speaks to that cultural moment. I have a colleague, Claire Morel, who works on the impact of social media on young people and how they think about the world. Others of us are working on how the social media culture affects worldviews, affects the social imaginary, affects our intuitions about how we relate to each other. I think one of the big challenges today is getting people who have been brought up on something like Twitter or social media and are used to thinking in terms of headlines, who tend to operate in online communities that are somewhat self-selecting. I think the big challenge we face is getting such people to think more broadly, to engage in a deeper and more radical way with big ideas. So there is a problem, I think, rising among young people, that the whole idea of intelligent, thoughtful, interactive debate, which I grew up with, is at something of a premium at the moment. And the EPCC, I think, plays into that because we provide, again, good articles that give people great ideas, not in a superficial way, but in an easily accessible and easily digestible way. The roots of today's debates about gender and freedom lie very, very deep. What we've seen in the West for the last 400 or 500 years, for example, is a slow decrease in authority of what I would call external markers for identity. If you were born in the Middle Ages, then the place you were born would pretty much dominate your entire life. You'd be unlikely to travel very far from it. Your calling, the job that you were going to pursue, would be provided to you by your birth. If your father was a blacksmith or a peasant farmer, you're going to be a blacksmith or a peasant farmer. Those things don't apply anymore. What we've seen emerge in the West is a world where our lives are full of so many choices that the nature of who we are and the nature of finding continuity in our lives has shifted from the external to the internal. We tend to focus now more and more on what we might call our self-consciousness or our psychology. So that's part of the story. Another part of the story is that sexual desire has always been a powerful force in human history. It dominates ancient Greek mythology, for example, and we can still read that today and resonate with it because we experience the power of that desire ourselves. And what we really have in the modern age is a combination of a growing lack of confidence or even suspicion of external authority, and a growing emphasis upon our inner desires, of which our sexual desires are perhaps the most powerful. And that has created the context in which sexual identity politics is able to emerge, or transgender politics, rejecting even the external authority of the sexed human body has emerged. And it's also facilitated the rise of a particular notion of freedom. In the Middle Ages, one might be free for something, or in the 17th century, if you look at Presbyterianism, human beings were free for the enjoyment and the glorification of God. Now we tend to think of freedom as freedom from external restraint. So those two factors have played into the rise of gender identity politics and strongly libertarian, even anarchic notions of freedom. The question of timeless truths has become somewhat vexed over recent years because the idea that there are things that don't change is very alien to the modern mentality. We live in a society that has perhaps changed more, for example, in the last 20 years than Europe changed between the 300 years from 1200 to 1500. So we intuitively bristle against the idea of timeless truths, but I would argue that there is such a thing as human nature. It's why we can read literature from other periods of time and it resonates with us. We can read the Iliad and sympathize with the feelings and the passions that the Iliad expresses. So there is such a thing as human nature. And I would say the timeless truths that will resonate today are the truths that connect to that human nature. For example, we all want to belong. Very few of us, if any of us at all, want to be completely isolated and on our own. We want to be part of a group. We want to be affirmed by others. So belonging is one important truth. We all want purpose in life. Some of the crazy stuff that goes on online, particularly among young men, indicates a craving for some sort of purpose. They want to belong to a group with a particular purpose. And I would say the key is, therefore, to find the true purpose. And if we can find the true way of belonging and the true nature of human destiny and purpose and present those, they will be compelling. The EPPC helps encourage a sense of human purpose and dignity by taking the whole notion of human nature seriously. The EPPC is Judeo-Christian in its roots, and at the heart of the Jewish faith and the Christian faith is the notion that human beings are made in the image of God. And that means that we have a human nature that is regulated by how we think about God. The fact that the EPPC takes that seriously indicates that the EPPC is able to present those truths in a way to the rising generation. One of the key roles that the EPPC can play, I think, is guiding the next generation of civic leaders. One of the things that makes the EPPC attractive to me is that it's a conservative think tank that isn't partisan. We live in a very partisan, divided world at the moment. What the EPPC is concerned about is truth rather than partisanship. And that's a message we need to cultivate in the rising generation of leaders. We can't simply cultivate a leadership class that demonize the opposition or demonize those who disagree with them. We need to create a leadership class or cultivate a leadership class that takes seriously big ideas and takes seriously proper engagement with those with whom we disagree. And I don't know of any think tank in DC that does that effectively or as intentionally as the EPPC does. The EPPC, I think, rises to the challenge of cultivating thoughtful and engaged civic leaders by modelling those values in its fellows. I'm honoured to have colleagues as fellows of the EPPC who embody exactly those virtues. They're not ignorant people. They're not lackeys of particular political parties. They're thoughtful engagers with the culture, with the tradition of Western thought on these things, and they seek to model in the way they live and the way they write and the way they speak and the way they interact with others, something to which all civic leaders should aspire. One of the ways that the EPPC, I think, can help rehabilitate, in some ways, college campus culture is being a presence there. Having fellows at the EPPC who are also college professors working with young people, that's a key way of operating. Having speakers come to campus is another great way. I think there's tremendous potential for the EPPC to have an impact on thoughtful young people and being a voice on campuses today and modeling in the way that we present ourselves and the way we treat those with whom we disagree in debates. A tremendous opportunity to model for young people what they should aspire to be themselves. If I were to describe the EPPC in one word, I would say thoughtful, because the EPPC models a form of engagement with the culture that seeks the truth and yet seeks to find the truth and express the truth in a generous, thoughtful, and clear manner. When I joined the EPPC just over 3 years ago, the world was in some ways very different to today. President Biden was in the White House, and it looked as if progressive ideology was going to carry all institutions before it. Since then, of course, we've had the election of President Trump. And I think the challenges have changed. In one sense, when I came on board 3 years ago, I think the transgender issue looked almost like a lost cause from a conservative perspective. There's been a very interesting and encouraging development on that front in the last year or two. On the other hand, I think what's emerged is threats from the other side of the political spectrum. The radical right, the rise of the so-called groypers online, having a particular impact on young men. That's a challenge that I did not anticipate rising. And I think it requires of the EPPC the same thoughtful, engagement and expression of truth that the days of radical progressive ideology did. But the enemy, if you like, or the problem is on the other side of the political spectrum at this particular moment in time.